The snow didn't just fall in the north. It hunted. I stumbled through the skeletal pines of the frostwood, my breath hitching in silver plumes as the scent of ozone and old blood filled the air. I never should have tried to cross the border during the Great Frost, but the shadow of my ex-mate Jack was longer than the winter itself. He was behind me, a master of psychological cruelty who viewed my escape as a theft of his property. My lungs burned with the cold and the secret I carried, a flicker of lethal ice magic that the Hypax would call a curse. I broke into a small clearing where a group of formidable warriors stood like stone monuments around a low fire. Their fur-lined cloaks were dusted with white, and their weapons gleamed with a deadly, polished edge. Among them stood a giant of a man. His dark hair pulled into intricate war braids, and his eyes as black as a frozen lake. He was a mountain of muscle and scarred leather, radiating a primal dominance that made my wolf whimper in instinctive submission. A twig snapped behind me. I didn't need to look back to know Jack had found the clearing. The familiar, oily scent of his presence made my skin crawl. Desperation, cold and sharp as a blade, shredded my pride. If Jack claimed me here, I would be a slave to his fire and ice forever. I lunged forward, closing the distance between me and the massive stranger before his guards could draw their steel. I reached up, my trembling fingers clutching the rough fur of his collar, as I stared into his obsidian gaze. "Please," I whispered, my voice cracking with a terror I could no longer hide. "Kiss me and act as my mate." "My life depends on it." The stranger's eyes narrowed, searching mine with a terrifying intensity, as if he could feel the blizzard trapped beneath my skin. A slow, dangerous smile curved his lips, a predator acknowledging a challenge. He didn't hesitate. His hand, massive and warm, cupped the back of my neck, and the Alpha King bent his head to claim my mouth, unaware that I was begging for mercy from the very man who ruled the frost. The kiss was a collision of ice and fire, a calculated claim that sent a shockwave of silence through the clearing. Ralph's touch was not the bruising grip I had come to expect from Jack, but a mountain's weight, immovable, ancient, and terrifyingly steady. Behind us, the sound of Jack's approaching footsteps faltered. I could feel his fury radiating through the frost, a toxic heat that withered the air. But he dared not move against the man currently branding me as his own. When Ralph finally pulled back, his obsidian eyes remained locked on mine, searching for the source of the strange wintry power he had tasted on my lips. He didn't release me. Instead, he draped a heavy fur-lined arm around my shoulders, tucking me into the heat of his side as if I were a prize he had held for a lifetime. "Is there a problem, traveler?" Ralph's voice was a low rumble that vibrated through my very bones. Jack stepped into the light of the fire, his face a mask of thwarted rage. His eyes darted between Ralph's war braids and the lethal-looking warriors who had shifted to flank us. "That Omega," Jack spat, his voice trembling with a lethal mix of obsession and fear, "belongs to my pack. She is a runaway thief." "She is under my protection now," Ralph replied, his tone almost bored yet laced with a threat that made the surrounding trees groan. "And in the north, my word is the only law that doesn't freeze." The realization hit me like a physical blow as the warriors bowed their heads. I hadn't just kissed a stranger. I had thrown myself at the Alpha King of the Northern Wastes. "Leave," Ralph commanded, and the sheer force of his alpha authority sent Jack staggering backward. My ex-mate gave me one last burning look, a promise of a future agony, before vanishing into the white dark of the pines. Ralph turned his gaze back to me, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw where the cold had begun to bite. "Now, little storm," he murmured, his voice private and sharp. We are going to the Citadel, and you are going to tell me why your blood tastes like a dying star and why the North itself seems to bow when you breathe. The Citadel of Frost loomed over us like a jagged crown of iron and ice, a fortress carved into the very heart of a glacier. Ralph did not lead me to a dungeon, but to a training courtyard where the wind whistled through arrow slits in the stone. The air here was thin and sharp, smelling of wet slate and the sweat of sparring warriors. I felt like a sparrow caught in a hawk's nest, my plain cloak tattered and my knees shaking from the long trek through the drifts. Your secret is a weapon you don't know how to aim, Ralph said, discarding his heavy fur mantle to reveal the corded muscle of his arms. In the North, we do not hide what we are. We master it, or it buries us. He handed me a practice blade, the cold steel biting into my palm. My submissiveness, a habit forged through years of Jack's psychological warfare, made me want to drop the weapon and kneel. I had been told my whole life that an Omega was a vessel, not a force. Ralph didn't care about my rank. He moved with a predator's grace, his obsidian eyes tracking my every flinch. Strike me, Bernice. Show me the blizzard you're hiding. I swung half-heartedly, the blade feeling like a lead weight. He parried it effortlessly, his body closing the distance until his chest pressed against mine, a wall of living heat in the freezing yard. Again, he commanded, his voice a low growl that vibrated against my skin. Think of the man who hunted you. Think of the chains he wants to put back on your soul. The memory of Jack's face, the possessive sneer and the promise of pain rushed through me like a surge of adrenaline. My control snapped. Instead of the blade striking, a wave of absolute zero erupted from my core. The air shattered. A localized frost burst from my feet, encasing the stone floor in a sheet of jagged blue ice that raced toward Ralph's boots. The warriors on the ramparts went silent, their hands moving to their hilts in a sudden, sharp alarm. Ralph didn't flinch. He looked down at the ice anchoring him to the ground, then back at me, a dark spark of respect lighting his gaze. Good, he whispered, his thumb catching a stray tear on my cheek before it could freeze. Tomorrow, we learn to make it lethal. The training session ended under a sky the color of bruised plums. While the rest of the Citadel sought the warmth of the Great Hall, Ralph led me through a series of hidden, stone-vaulted corridors to his private quarters. The room was sparse, filled with the scent of cedar and old parchment. A single hearth roared, casting long, flickering shadows against the walls. You pushed the magic back today, Ralph said, his voice softer than the growl he used in the yard. He sat on a low bench and pulled his tunic over his head, revealing the expanse of his back. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. His skin was a map of the North's violent history. Thick, ropey scars from claws crisscrossed his shoulders, and near his spine lay a jagged, puckered mark that looked like it had been carved by fire. It was the mark of a sun-eater, the ancient enemies who hunted his line. Seeing the Alpha King, the man who seemed like an invincible mountain, so physically broken, made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. Those scars, I whispered, stepping closer despite the submissiveness screaming in my blood. They're from Jack's kin, aren't they? Ralph turned slightly, his obsidian eyes meeting mine with a raw honesty that felt more intimate than the kiss in the woods. They are. My father died to keep them from the heart of this mountain. I have spent my reign ensuring I was the weapon the North needed to survive. He reached out, his warm, calloused fingers wrapping around my wrist, pulling me into the space between his knees. I see the same scars on your soul, Bernice. You were made a victim, but you were born to be a storm. I placed my palm against the jagged burn on his shoulder. My ice magic hummed beneath my skin. Not as a threat, but as a cooling balm. For the first time, the dominance radiating from him didn't make me want to hide. It made me want to stand. We stayed there in the silence of the hearth, two broken things finding a terrifying, beautiful symmetry. He wasn't just my protector. He was the only soul who truly understood that power was often a burden disguised as a gift. The sanctuary of the private quarters was shattered the next morning by the sound of a lone, wounded messenger collapsing at the Citadel's inner gate. Lyra, Ralph's senior advisor, burst into the war room where we were studying border maps. Her ink-stained fingers trembled as she dropped a blood-slicked piece of parchment onto the stone table. The handwriting was elegant, a sharp contrast to the crimson stains. Jack's hand. The letter was a masterpiece of cruelty. It didn't demand my return. It described the screams of my younger sister, Maya. Jack had snatched her from the southern borders, using her as the ultimate lure to draw me out of Ralph's shadow. My control, so carefully practiced in the training yard, ruptured instantly. Frost climbed the walls of the war room in jagged, hungry spikes, the temperature plummeting until the ink in Lyra's wells cracked the glass. "He's in the walls," Ralph growled, his hand heavy on my shoulder to anchor me. "Not literally, but he has eyes here." He gestured to the messenger who bore the mark of a sun-eater spy, a faint, branded sun on the inside of his wrist. Jack hadn't just sent a threat. He had proven that even the Alpha King's fortress was porous to his manipulation. Panic clawed at my chest, the old submissiveness whispering that I should run, that I should give myself up to save Maya. But when I looked at Ralph, I saw a reflection of the fire I had touched on his scarred shoulder. He wasn't looking at me with pity, but with the cold, calculating gaze of a monarch preparing for total war. "We don't just go for your sister," Ralph stated, his voice ringing with a finality that silenced the frost. "We go to end him. But first, we find the traitor who opened the gate." The realization that Jack's reach extended into the very heart of my new home turned my blood to ice. Not the magic I could control, but a cold, hollow dread that I was still being hunted from the inside. The winter ball was not a celebration. It was a trap set in silk and silver. Ralph insisted we proceed with the gala to draw the traitors into the light, but the air in the great hall felt as thin as a mountain peak. I was no longer the girl in tattered furs. I stood at Ralph's side in a gown of midnight velvet, my moon-pale hair braided with silver wire, looking every bit the queen the North feared I might become. The room was a sea of alphas and high-ranking wolves, their gazes cataloging my every move, like predators assessing a new threat. Ralph's hand remained steady on the small of my back, a constant reminder that I was under the king's protection. Yet I could feel the ripple of Jack's poison in the whispers that died down as we passed. "You look like the storm before the strike," Ralph murmured, his obsidian eyes reflecting the thousands of candles flickering in the chandeliers. "Stay centered. Remember the training." The tension snapped when an alpha from a border pack, a man with eyes full of naked calculation, stepped into our path. He didn't bow. Instead, he let a wave of oppressive dominance roll off him, a direct challenge to an Omega standing where I did. "A pretty thing, King Ralph," he sneered, his voice carrying through the sudden silence of the hall. "But a broken Omega wielding forbidden magic is a rot in our foundation. Perhaps she needs a master who knows how to break a wild dog." My wolf snarled, and for the first time it wasn't out of fear. I felt the ice in my blood surge, but I didn't let it explode. I reached out and touched the alpha's glass of wine. I didn't strike him. I simply chose to let the cold flow. The liquid froze instantly, shattering the crystal in his hand, and a frost pattern shaped like a wolf's skull crawled up his sleeve, pinning his arm to his side in a cage of ice. "I am not a dog," I said, my voice as steady as the glacier beneath us. "And I have already chosen my king." Ralph's laugh was a dark, prideful sound that sent a shiver through the room. The alpha retreated, his face pale with shock. But as the crowd shifted, I caught a glimpse of a figure in the shadows of the balcony. A silhouette that made my heart freeze for a different reason. Jack was here, watching from the dark, and the betrayal Ralph feared was closer than we realized. The shadows of the balcony had barely settled when the heavy iron doors of the great hall groaned open, not for a guest, but for a betrayal that chilled the room more than my magic ever could. Lord Kalen, Ralph's most trusted strategist and a man who had sat at our war table for weeks, stepped forward with a jagged sunfire relic glowing in his palm. The air in the hall turned thick and scorched, a direct antithesis to the northern frost. "The north has grown cold and stagnant under a king who protects monsters," Kalen proclaimed, his voice amplified by the ancient artifact. "Jack has promised a new dawn, one where fire purifies the weak." The transition was instantaneous. Hidden Sun Eater sympathizers among the guards drew their blades, turning on their brothers in arms. Ralph lunged toward Kalen, but the relic flared with a sickly, blinding heat. It was a weapon designed specifically to dampen Alpha Command, and I watched in horror as Ralph, the man who was a mountain, was forced to one knee, his obsidian eyes burning with a localized agony. "Ralph!" I screamed, but Kalen's men were already moving to intercept me. Through the chaos, Jack stepped out from behind a stone pillar, a possessive, triumphant sneer twisting his features as he looked at me. He didn't look at the battle. He only looked at his property. In his hand, he held a shimmering silver key, the key to the Citadel's back gates, which Kalen had handed him in the dark. "I told you no one else could keep you, Bernice," Jack called out over the screams and the clash of steel. "The king is falling, and your sister is waiting in the ruins. Choose now. Come to me, or watch this mountain become a tomb." The betrayal was complete. The fortress was porous, the king was incapacitated, and the man who haunted my nightmares was holding the heart of the North in his hands. But as I looked at Ralph struggling against the sunfire, I felt a flicker of something Jack had never been able to extinguish. The cold, sharp resolve to burn it all down to save my own. The Citadel groaned as the sunfire relic's heat warped the very stone of the great hall, turning the air into a shimmering, suffocating haze. Ralph remained on one knee, his muscles corded as he fought the ancient artifact that suppressed his alpha command. Kalen's traitors moved with practiced cruelty, cutting down loyalists while the back gates swung wide to admit Jack's hidden army of Sun Eaters. The siege had begun not from the walls, but from within the heart of the northern throne. "Look at your king," Jack mocked, stepping through the chaos with the silver key glinting around his neck. "He cannot even stand, let alone protect a broken Omega like you." He reached for my throat, his eyes filled with a terrifying, predatory light that promised a lifetime of chains. I didn't back away this time. The submissiveness that had once defined me was gone, replaced by a cold fury that made my skin tingle with frost. I looked at Ralph, and even through his pain, his obsidian eyes shouted for me to hold the line. "I am not broken," I whispered, and the temperature in the hall began to plummet in defiance of the relic's heat. Before Jack could touch me, I slammed my palms against the stone floor. A wall of jagged, crystalline ice erupted between us, thick enough to stop a charging wolf. The ice didn't just block him, it absorbed the ambient sunfire, turning the deadly heat into steam that blinded the attackers. "The Citadel is not yours to take," I snarled. The Sun Eaters surged forward, their blades wreathed in orange flame, but I was no longer a sparrow in a hawk's nest. I was the storm. I channeled the blizzard I had once feared, sending shards of ice through the air like frozen arrows. As the battle raged around us, I realized the ruins were the final destination. Jack began to retreat toward the secret tunnels, dragging a terrified Maya behind him. "Follow them!" Ralph roared, finally breaking the relic's hold as the frost I created cracked the artifact's shell. The citadel of frost shivered under the weight of a magic that had been dormant for centuries. As I chased Jack into the deep tunnels leading toward the ruins, the air grew heavy with the scent of copper and ancient, hungry stone. Jack held Maya by the throat, her small frame dangling over a ritual pit where the Sun-Eaters had once sacrificed the blood of northern alphas. The Sunfire relic, though cracked, still pulsed with a sickly light, attempting to drain the life from the very mountain. "You're too late, Bernice!" Jack screamed, his face twisted by the obsession that had become his rot. "The ritual is set. Your power will fuel the permanent winter, and I will be the only sun left in the world." I saw Ralph emerge from the shadows behind me, his obsidian eyes burning with a lethal promise. He was wounded, his chest heaving, but he stood like a pillar of the north. He didn't rush in. He met my eyes, a silent command passing between us. He was the anchor, but I was the storm. "I am not the weapon you get to aim, Jack," I said, my voice resonating with the power of the glacier itself. I stopped fighting the darkness in my blood. I opened the gates I had spent a lifetime trying to lock. The curse erupted, not as a chaotic explosion, but as a masterpiece of absolute control. Frost didn't just climb the walls. It rewrote them. A localized blizzard materialized within the chamber, a swirling vortex of white that ignored Ralph but turned Jack's breath to glass in his lungs. The ground beneath us, the ancient cursed stone of the ruins, recognized my shadow ice. It didn't fight me. It fed me. I felt the lineage of every dark omega who had been hunted and hidden, their strength pouring into my limbs. With a roar of power, I slammed my hands together. A pillar of pure, black-tinted ice erupted from the ritual pit, shattering the Sunfire relic into 1,000 harmless shards. The shockwave sent Jack flying backward, his hold on Maya breaking as she was caught by a cushion of soft snow I manifested. I stepped toward him, the ruins glowing with a pale blue light that emanated from my skin. The Frost Queen had not just awakened. She had claimed her throne. The heavy silence that followed the collapse of the ruins was more profound than any storm. Jack lay broken against the jagged stone, stripped of his stolen fire and the toxic obsession that had nearly razed the north. Ralph moved through the settling frost, his obsidian eyes fixed not on the fallen enemy, but on me. He didn't reach for me as a conqueror or a master. He stopped a respectful distance away, his hands open and stained with the soot of battle. "It's over, Bernice," he said, his voice a low, rough anchor in the aftermath of my power. In the weeks that followed, the Citadel of Frost began to breathe again. The Great Thaw had ended, but a new era was freezing into place. Ralph did not present me to the council as a prize or a weapon. Instead, he stood before the gathered alphas and handed me a sealed scroll, a legal decree that granted me a new identity and complete freedom to leave the northern wastes forever. "You begged a stranger for a kiss to buy your freedom," Ralph stated, his voice ringing through the great hall. "I will not be the one to steal it back. You are a queen of the frost by your own right, and the gate is open if you wish to walk through it." I looked at the scroll, then at the man who had taught me that my magic was a gift, not a curse. I thought of the chronic submissiveness I had shed in the training yards and the ruins. My choice was no longer driven by fear or the need for a shield. I tore the scroll in half, the parchment fluttering to the stone floor like autumn leaves. I stepped toward the throne, not as an omega seeking protection, but as a partner ready to rule. I have spent my life running from shadows, I said, meeting the gazes of the alphas who once looked at me with pity. I think it's time I stayed and led the storm. Ralph's smile was a rare, genuine spark that transformed his battle-hardened face. He took my hand, his thumb tracing the knuckles where my power now hummed in perfect, quiet control. Together we looked out over a kingdom that was no longer a cage of tradition, but a realm of choice.